Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been amazing to hear all these stories today. I'm also just going to share my story with you, and I hope that it's a blessing. I'm going to start from the beginning because I had a very all-American, carefree sort of childhood. I grew up about an hour north of Chicago. My parents were always married. I had an older brother and an older sister, and they were usually pretty good to me. Life as a kid seemed pretty wonderful and easy and carefree. There weren't really many trials or tragedies in my life as a child, so I sort of thought life was always going to be really simple and easy. But it was when I was around the ages of 12, 13 years old in junior high that I started to realize that the world just wasn't as great as I thought it was. People weren't as genuine as I thought they were. Some of my best friends were starting to betray me. I started to realize that things like wars were going on in the world, homelessness was a reality, sexual abuse was a reality, and I became burdened by all of those problems. I wanted to do something to make a difference in the world if I could, something to make the world a little bit of a better place if I could. So I started volunteering in a local homeless shelter every Friday night for about a year. And at the end of that year, I just felt like homelessness was just as much of a problem as when I had first started volunteering, so I hadn't made much of a difference in the world, so I sort of put helping other people in the back of my mind as I went into high school. And I started to just focus on trying to make myself, my family, and my friends happy. That seemed to work for a little bit of a while. I had a lot of friends. My boyfriend was prom king. I was on the soccer team. In many ways, life just seemed to be good again. But very quickly and very unexpectedly, things started to go wrong. Within about a year and a half to 2 years' time, I lost 4 of my friends. One died in a car accident. One died in a motorcycle accident. One died because of suicide. And one died because of a brain tumor. And at the ages of 16, 17 years old, I just really had no idea how to handle any of it. I didn't know that I could go to God for comfort or wisdom or strength or understanding. And I was sort of the friend that everybody went to for help with their problems, so I kept all of my problems inside and to myself. I thought that when things aren't going well, you just pretend like they are. You're supposed to just put a smile on your face and pretend like they are. On top of those 4 friends that died, within that same period of time, I lost my grandmother, I was being stalked by 2 young men, and I was raped by another. Because I kept everything inside and I wasn't going to anyone for help, I really started to spiral down into a deep and scary depression that I didn't really even notice I was in. I didn't realize what was wrong with me. My parents knew that something was wrong with me, so they're taking me to see lots of doctors, because I was physically getting sick every single day. Eventually, the doctor said there was nothing wrong with me physically. There must just be something wrong with me psychologically because of all the stress and anxiety from the things that had happened in my life. So they put me on an antidepressant and sent me to counseling. But I didn't take the medicine on any regular basis, and I didn't really tell the counselor anything, so those things didn't help me very much. I continued to spiral down. Around that same time, I started smoking and drinking a lot, mostly just to numb the pain that I felt inside. I hoped that it would make me happier, a little bit more joyful in my life if possible. It really just made my problems a lot more complicated and worse, though. And eventually, New Year's Eve of my senior year came, and I was supposed to be grounded because I had been skipping school and skipping classes a lot. But my parents were going to be nice and just let me go out this one night. Normally, my curfew had been midnight, but they were going to let me come home at 12:30 because it was New Year's Eve. And I wasn't really satisfied with that. I wanted to either sleep over at a friend's house or come home at 3 o'clock in the morning. And that wasn't reasonable for me at 17 years old, but we went back and forth for about an hour about it. Eventually, I realized I probably wasn't going to get my way, so I agreed to come home at 12:30, but I left the house knowing that I wasn't going to come home at all that night. And I remember that I went to work. I got picked up by my friends when I was done working, and we went to a party. And that night, I didn't smoke or drink. I was actually the designated driver, so I felt like I was making a lot of good decisions that night. But I called my mom about 11:30 to tell her that I wasn't going to be coming home that night. And I hung up before she could say anything to me. It wasn't until 10 o'clock the next morning when I came home. And because my parents were always very loving and very caring and protective, they were up all night waiting for me, and by the time that I got there, they were just beside themselves. The first thing I remember my mom saying to me was, "Kristen, we didn't know if you were dead in a ditch somewhere or what had happened to you." And I remember that I felt very bad, I felt very guilty, I felt like I just let them down, I disappointed them again. But they didn't know everything that had been really going on in my life. They didn't know how deeply my friends' deaths affected me. They didn't even know that I had been raped. They thought that I was just being rebellious. So they did two things to try and get my attention. They told me that they were going to take away all the things they got me for Christmas. They were either going to return them or give them to someone who would appreciate them. And they were going to ground me until further notice. And that was very, very difficult for me because I was very materialistic. I found a lot of my value in the things that I had and the way that I looked, so to have my things taken away was hard for me. And to have my friends taken away from me was very hard for me because my friends were basically all I was living for at that time. My whole world revolved around my friends. So to be grounded until further notice was close to devastating for me. But that day I slept. I slept that whole day because I'd been up the whole night before. And the next morning was a Sunday morning, so we went to church. That's something that we did every single Sunday morning of my entire life. I went to church, I went to Sunday school, I went to youth group, all of it. But I went to church, and I left church that day feeling exactly the same way, feeling just completely beaten down, discouraged, lost, hurt, confused. And after we got home from church, my mom laid down to take a nap on the couch. She was tired from waiting up for me that whole night. My dad went to buy a new washer and dryer. So I decided I wanted to do something to try and cheer myself up a little bit if I could. I had two little nephews at the time. They were like ages 1 and 3, and I had videos of them opening their Christmas presents just a month earlier. So I thought maybe putting in those movies and watching them open their Christmas presents would bring a smile to my face, make me a little bit happier about life, give me something to look forward to. So I put those movies in, and I was only watching them for about 5 minutes when I got a phone call. The phone call was from my best friend, Kelly. Kelly and I had been friends since we were in 2nd grade, and she was calling because she wanted me to come over to her house to make gingerbread houses. This was our last day of Christmas break before we were supposed to go back to school, and I knew that I shouldn't be going anywhere because I was grounded until further notice. But Kelly wasn't always the best influence in my life, and together we made the unfortunate decision that I couldn't get in any worse trouble if I left, so I did. And I wrote a note to my parents, very dishonestly saying that I was going for a walk, even though that's not what I was doing. And I was gone for about 5 hours. My friend picked me up down the street because she didn't want to get in trouble for taking me when I was grounded. And she dropped me off down the street because she didn't want to get in trouble for taking me when I was grounded. And when I started to walk home, about 5 hours after I had left, I just didn't feel like I could go home. I didn't feel like I could face my parents. I didn't feel like I wanted to disappoint them again. I didn't want to get in trouble again. I really just didn't want to deal with life at that moment. So to waste some time, give myself some time to think, I walked to the pizza restaurant that I had been working at. It was only about a block away. While I was there, I got my paycheck, I got a pack of cigarettes, and I just tried to waste time. About 45 minutes later, I had this sinking feeling that like I really needed to go home because my parents would be really worried about me again. I was probably going to get in trouble again, and I just really didn't want to worry them anymore. So I started to walk home again. And while I was walking, I still felt like I just couldn't do it. I didn't have the strength or whatever inside of me to go home. And it was very interesting because I didn't really grow up in a bad home. I had a great family. But I was so broken and so overwhelmed by the world and the way that it had affected my life that I just didn't feel like I had anything in me to deal with anything anymore. So I walked kitty corner across the street from my parents' house. Kitty corner across the street from my parents' house was a park that I grew up playing in. And I started to swing on the swings while I was there. And I started to remember all these happy childhood memories that I had as a kid. I remember playing in this park, swinging on the swings, going to the beach, swimming in the lake, all sorts of happy memories there. And I started to contrast those happy childhood memories with how I was feeling now as a teenager. So broken, so lost, so overwhelmed, so confused, so hurt. And I couldn't make sense of how I could go from having such a perfect, amazing, beautiful, happy-ish childhood to being so broken and lost and confused and hurt as a teenager. I didn't know how to move forward. I didn't know how to move back. I felt like I'd been walking in circles. I kept hoping that things were going to get better, kept believing that things were going to get better, but one thing just happened after another, and it felt like things were just getting worse and worse. Eventually, as I was thinking through all this, I remembered in this small town I grew up in, about an hour north of Chicago, you're not allowed to be in the park after dark. Just for safety's sake, the police will patrol the park, and if you're there, they'll make you go home. But the reason I was there was because I didn't want to go home. So I looked to see where else I could go. Just wanted a little bit more time to think. And as I looked around, I saw a train that had been parked on the edge of the park. I figured for about 3 weeks. Because I had driven by, it hadn't moved at all, so I figured it wasn't going anywhere. So I walked over to the train and I sat on it. A lot of times people ask me, did you play on trains or train tracks when you were a kid? And no, I didn't. This was the first time I ever ventured that close to a train. But as I was sitting there, it triggered a thought process I'd had about 3 months beforehand. And that was as I was grieving through my friend Brandon's death. My friend Brandon's death was the hardest for me because he's the friend that I lost to suicide. And I just could never make sense of it. I didn't understand how he could ever take his life, why he would ever do that, why he would ever do it the way that he did that. And I remember thinking that night, 3 months beforehand, I could never do that. I could never take my life. I could never commit suicide, especially the way that he did that. But then my thought process started to change. And I thought, well, I would never do it, but if I ever did it, how would I do it? If I would never do it the way that he did it, how would I do it, even though I would never do it? And I went through a number of different things in my mind, things I'd heard about, read about, or seen on TV, and none of them seemed like they would necessarily work or be good enough. But then a train went by my parents' house. And I could feel the power of the train sort of shake our home. I could hear the whistle blare through the windows, and it just snapped in my mind. That's one way. I could never live through it. And I never thought about it again until 3 months later when I was sitting on the train that day. And that's when suicide entered my mind as an option or as an answer. To be very honest with you, I really didn't want to die. I just wanted my life to get a little bit better. I wanted my life to be a little bit easier. I wanted to be a little bit happier. But it felt like things were just getting worse and worse. And I started to feel like this maybe was my only hope or my only answer, bringing my life to an end. So I was really back and forth in my mind because I would think there's a reason I'm here, and then I would think there's no reason I'm here. And then I would think there's something I'm supposed to do here, and then I would think there's nothing I'm supposed to do here. Then I would think it's going to get better, and then I would think it's not going to get any better. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I think there was a very spiritual battle going on in my head. I think that the positive, truthful thoughts were coming from the Lord himself, and I think that the negative, false thoughts were coming from Satan himself. But I didn't know that, so I didn't know to fight against those false negative thoughts. I just thought that I was really confused in the head, really messed up or something, and I continued to be back and forth like that for about an hour and a half until a train started to come. And I hadn't made a decision. I didn't know what I was going to do. But I knew that I had to make some sort of a decision or go somewhere because it was 8:30 at night. It was January 2nd. It was freezing cold out. I'd already been outside for probably about 2 hours at that time. I knew that I couldn't stay outside much longer. I needed to go somewhere and make some sort of a decision. So right before the train got to me, I made the impulsive decision to lay down on the tracks. And I remember that as I got off the train I was sitting on, just trying to push down the fear and the shame that I felt on the inside. Because I knew what I was about to do wasn't right. I knew it wasn't the answer, but I didn't know what was. So right before the train got to me, I laid down on the tracks. And I remember that I closed my eyes, I clenched my fists, and I turned my head in the opposite direction than where the train was coming from because I didn't want to watch it come at me. And as I lay there, I basically just tried to brace myself for what was about to come. It was only about a split second before the train started to go over me. And what I remember when the train first started to go over me is I remember that it began to suck me upward, almost into itself, which I guess is what should have happened. It says in the police report that 33 freight train cars went over me at 55 miles per hour. And that because of how I was positioned beneath the train and how fast the train was going, I basically should have been sucked up underneath the train and torn to pieces. But obviously that isn't what happened. Very quickly after I felt myself being sucked up underneath the train, I felt this force begin to push me down and hold me down into the ground. And I really believe very strongly that that was God just mercifully sparing and protecting my life. But I didn't realize it at the moment. I just remember feeling all of these things and hearing the train roar above me. Eventually, I heard the train come to a stop. And I didn't know what to think or what to believe. I didn't know if I was alive or dead. I didn't really know what had just happened. My thoughts were racing. But I wanted to know what had just happened and if I was alive or if I was dead. So I opened my eyes, I unclenched my fists, and I started to look around. Mostly just wanted to know if I was alive or dead. And as I looked around, I looked behind me to my right. And behind me to my right, about 10 feet away, were my legs. I knew that they were my legs because they had these brand new bright white tennis shoes on them that I'd just gotten for Christmas. But it felt like a terrible nightmare. I couldn't really believe that that was happening. I couldn't believe that those were my legs. I couldn't believe that I was laying on train tracks. I couldn't believe any of it. I didn't know how to make sense of any of it, so I sort of gathered myself emotionally. I crawled out from underneath the train, and I began to look down at my legs because I wanted to see if they were actually gone. And when I looked down at my left leg, it had been severed so high, and it was so dark outside I couldn't see anything there. So I turned my attention to my right leg, and it looked like it had been severed below the knee, but I'd never seen my leg like that before. I'd never even seen an amputated leg before. So I took my hand and I ran it below where it looked like it had been severed, because I knew if I could do that, it was actually gone. And when I did that, I unintentionally brought my hand up to my face. And when I brought my hand up to my face, I saw all of the blood. And when I saw all of the blood is when the pain really hit me. Because when the train was going over me, the pain that I felt was sort of a dull in the background sort of pain. And now it was a much more loud, in your face, really painful kind of pain. And I started crying harder than I'd ever cried in my life. The way that a small child would, I started crying for my mom. And I was in the worst pain I'd ever been in my life. But as I laid there crying in this terrible, terrible pain, all of a sudden, I started to feel this tremendous peace start to cover me. And I started to hear the song Amazing Grace play over and over in my mind. And my first thought was that could only be music from heaven. I thought that I was about to die, and I just needed to lose a little bit more blood. So I basically laid there resting in that peace, hoping and praying to die, hoping that heaven would be a better place than this earth. Not really realizing what it took to get into heaven or anything like that, just hoping it would be a better place than this earth. And as I laid there resting in that peace, all of a sudden, I felt somebody pull my hair off my face and behind my ear. And I wasn't really expecting anybody to find me. I didn't want anybody to find me. I didn't want anybody to help me. I wanted just to be left alone. But when I felt somebody pull my hair off my face and behind my ear, I looked up to see who it was. And it was a firefighter who sort of stumbled back because he wasn't expecting me to be alive. But he found me because it actually says in the police report that the conductor said to the engineer, "Did you see that yellow flash?" And the engineer said to the conductor, "Yes, I think we just hit someone." The yellow flash that they had seen was my bright yellow jacket as I laid down on the tracks. So they had called 911 right away. But it took them a while to get to me because the train had stopped on the road that led them to the park. So the paramedics and the firefighters had been walking the tracks looking for me. And this was the first man who found me. Eventually, he radioed to the other medical staff and personnel of my location and my status. And as soon as they got to me, they determined that I needed to be taken by Flight for Life to a big hospital in Milwaukee. Shortly after that, they realized that they couldn't Flight for Life me because the weather was too bad. It was a really foggy night. So they did something that they have never done since, that wasn't protocol, that they had never done beforehand. And this was that they blocked all of the roads in the intersections from where I was to the closest hospital in the area that could take me. It says in the police report that it's normally a 45-minute drive, but that they got me there in 8 minutes. And I love sharing details like that because I feel like God cannot be denied in details like that. When I got to the hospital, I remember that all the doctors and nurses were asking me what my name was, what my birthday was, what my parents' names were, what their phone number was, what my sister's name was, what her phone number was. They were asking me all sorts of questions, and I was able to answer all of them. They say that they felt like they were witnessing some sort of a miracle because I had lost 8 pints of blood, and scientifically you're supposed to die after you lose 5. But I was still very much alive. I was still very much conscious. I was talking. I was able to answer all of their questions. But I didn't really feel like any sort of a miracle. I didn't really want to be any sort of a miracle. I was still hoping, praying, wishing, and waiting to die. I remember even as they wheeled me down into the operating room, looking up at the doctor, hoping that he would give me some sort of assurance that I just maybe wasn't going to make it. I asked him if he thought I was going to live or die, and he said he didn't know. And he says he told me that because he wanted me to go into surgery that night fighting to die, fighting to live one way or another. He wanted me to go into surgery that night fighting. And I was in surgery that whole night. They did a number of blood transfusions in order to save my life. And they also tried to reattach my legs, which is something they weren't successful at doing. It was the next day, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when I woke up in the intensive care unit. And I remember that as I opened my eyes, I saw my mom, my dad, my sister, my brother, and my brother-in-law, all with their arms crossed and their heads looking down at the floor. And my immediate thought was, wow, something really bad must have just happened. Because I didn't remember the events from the previous night yet. I just woke up. But my mom's eyes met with mine first, and she ran to the side of my bed, and she said, "Oh, honey, we're so glad you're okay." And all the memories from the night before came back, and I was like, "Mom, they cut my clothes, and they cut my coat." And she said, "Honey, it's okay. We can get you new ones. We're just glad you're okay." I sort of listened to that, fell back asleep. I was on a lot of medicine. The next thing I remember was waking up because my doctor came to tell me what my injuries were. He told me that my left leg was severed well above the knee, that my right leg was severed directly below the knee, but that I might be able to walk with the use of prosthetic legs one day. And I honestly think that he was trying to be very encouraging and hopeful, give me something to look forward to. But I wasn't ready to deal with it. I wasn't ready to face it at all yet. I was pretty rude towards him, actually. I just stared out the window. I didn't say hi. I didn't say bye. I didn't say thank you. I just waited for him to leave. When he left, I fell back asleep. The next thing I remember was waking up a different day and just feeling kind of gross and icky because I hadn't showered in days and I'd just been through this traumatic experience. So I asked my mom if I could call my best friend, Kelly. She said that would be fine. She dialed the number for me and handed me the phone. When Kelly got on the phone, she told me she would be right there, no problem. She'd do my hair, my makeup, whatever I needed. But then she asked me how I was doing. And I really was not prepared for that question. I did not know how to answer it at all. But I felt like I had to tell her something. She was my best friend. She cared a lot about me. I knew she would want to know something. So after she asked me how I was doing, I took a deep breath. And I said, I'm okay. I looked down at my legs to see if they were actually gone still, hoping they would have come back. I would have woken up from this terrible dream or something. But as I looked down, my legs looked the same. They were still gone. So I said to her, I'm okay, but my legs are cut off. And tears just started to stream down my face because that's the moment that it became real to me. That's when I realized my legs were really gone and they weren't coming back. It wasn't just a terrible nightmare. This was my new reality. And she just said, oh, honey, it's okay. You're going to be fine. You don't need your legs. You're going to be fine. And a lot of times people think, how could she have said that? That sounds so simple. That sounds so trite. How could she have said that? But it was actually exactly what I needed to hear. I needed to know that my best friend thought I was going to be fine with or without my legs. She thought I was going to be just fine. And in the coming weeks and the coming months, all of my family and all of my friends just surrounded me, and they loved me like crazy. One of the things they told me over and over again was, Kristen, God kept you here for a reason. There's something you're supposed to do here. They said, Kristen, God kept you here for a reason. There's something you're supposed to do here. They said it so much that I almost got sick of it because I didn't know why I was here or what I was supposed to do here. But the first weekend that we got out of the hospital, just for the weekend, we went back to church on Sunday. And while we were there, a woman who had heard about what happened to me that I didn't know came up to me and told me that I would have went to hell if I died. And that was very, very hard for me in the moment because everyone else around me told me what I call the feel-good answer. They said, oh, Kristen, of course you would have went to heaven. Don't worry about it. You would have been fine. You would have went to heaven. But this lady told me that I would have went to hell. And it concerned me because everybody also said that I was a miracle, or that was a miracle that I survived, that I shouldn't have lived. Scientifically, there's no way I should have lived. So I wanted to know if I would have died like I should have, where I would have been right then. Would I have been in heaven or would I have been in hell? I wanted to know where I would have been right then. So her saying that to me really sent me searching. And eventually, a couple that my sister was friends with came to have dinner with her family. The husband of the couple, I found out, was in seminary to be a pastor. So I figured that he knew the Bible more than anyone else that I knew. And I asked him if he thought I would have went to heaven or hell if I died. And he told me, very sensitively, that every single one of us are created to be in this very real and personal relationship with God. But because of our sin and because of the wrong things that we've done, we are both separated from him relationally and eternally. And that's why Jesus died, to pay the penalty for our sin so that we can be put back into a right relationship with him and so that we can spend eternity in heaven with him. But we have to choose to accept Jesus for the forgiveness of our sins, and we have to choose to let him lead our lives. And when he told me that, I knew that what he was telling me was something more true than I'd ever heard in my life before. But I didn't want to just take his word for it. So I asked him to show me it in the Bible. And he showed me a lot of different verses. But the verse that stood out to me the most was John 14:6. And that's where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And after reading that, I just felt like Jesus could not have been more clear. He said that he was the way to God. He was the way to truth. He was the way to life. And I knew that I had never made any sort of a decision to accept Jesus for the forgiveness of my sins or to let him lead my life. I knew that I didn't have a relationship with God. He had always felt very far away and distant to me. But I also knew that something very, very special and important was missing in my life. And I knew that after trying to take my own life, that I definitely was a sinner and that I had a lot to be forgiven for. So sitting on the floor in my parents' dining room, I just prayed the most simple little prayer. I asked God to forgive me for everything that I had done wrong, even the sin of trying to take my own life. I realized that night that my life wasn't mine to take. I asked God to give me a new life and to make it all better somehow. And I remember that as I went to sleep that night, I just felt a little bit different. I felt like something had been lifted off of my shoulders and like I didn't need to worry so much anymore about my life or what would come of it. I know that that's the night that I became a Christian. And it's always interesting for me to talk about that because my whole life I would have told you I was a Christian because I believed in God. I went to church. I believed Jesus was the Son of God. But I'd never made that choice to accept Jesus for the forgiveness of my sin. And I never chose to let him lead my life. I never had that real relationship with God that I was created for. That night, I started a relationship with him. And sometimes I wish I could tell you that it all changed overnight, but it didn't. I still struggled with suicidal thoughts and depression for about 3 years after my suicide attempt and after I became a Christian. I was in and out of psych wards on the anniversary of my suicide attempt every single year. I was on a lot of antidepressants and pain medications. I was struggling with school, but I had an amazing Christian counselor who spoke more truth into my life than anyone else around me. One of the very first things she ever had me do was memorize Romans 8:1. And that's where it says, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. It was very important for me to learn that verse, to memorize it, and to let it sink deeply into my heart and into my soul. Because for those years after my suicide attempt, I didn't realize it for a long time, but I had been punishing myself for what I had done to myself and how it had forever changed my life. I realized after learning that verse and letting it transform me that really there was no reason for me not to forgive myself if God had forgiven me. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. I realized that by not forgiving myself, I was holding myself in this depression that I also so desperately wanted out of. So I started to forgive myself. It was a long process. But in that process, in the middle of that actually, I met a woman at the community college I was going to who just shined with more peace and more joy and more love for life than anybody I had ever met before. And I remember after meeting her, going home and just saying to God, I want to know you the way that lady knows you. Because after talking to her, I knew that this peace and this joy and this love for life that she had came from her relationship with him. And what I felt him tell me was, Kristen, you have to let me be your best friend. At that point in my life, I had started to go to my friends and my family and my doctors and anyone else who would listen for help with my problems, but I wasn't going to him for help with my problems. And I realized that night that he was the one who created me. He was the one who knew me better than anyone else in this world. He was the one who knew my problems better than anyone else in this world. And he was the one who knew the answers to my problems more than anyone else in this world. So I started going to him for help. I started letting him be my best friend. And the more that I walked towards him, the more I felt like I was walking straight out of my depression. I started getting involved with a really good church close to my home. And the more I walked towards him, the more my life started to change. I was able to get off of all of my antidepressants and all of my pain meds that my doctors told me I would have to take for the rest of my life. I've been off of them for 9 years now. I was able to quit smoking. I was able to quit drinking, all the more that I centered my life around the Lord. And because of the change that my mom saw in my life, she started coming to church with me. And after she started coming to church with me, she became a Christian. She started bringing my dad to church with her, and he became a Christian. And he started to bring my brother to church with him, and he became a Christian. So it was a very, very special time in our family. In a lot of ways, because we always thought we were Christians, but we never knew the Lord. We never knew the strength of his word. We never knew the power of his spirit. We never knew the comfort of his love. We never knew how much healing he could bring to our hearts after everything that had happened. But he brought a lot of healing in that time to my family. We started, serving together in church, listening to a lot of the same Christian music, reading books together, praying together. We were always close, but we were close in a much deeper way now. Shortly after that, I was asked to share my story with the teenagers in the high school youth group at our church. And that wasn't something I was looking to do or really even feeling at all prepared to do. But it ended up being something I was willing to do because I didn't want people to have to learn things the hard way like I did. I didn't want them to have to learn from their own mistakes as much as I did. If they could learn from my mistakes, I wanted them to do that. I didn't want them to wait till something terrible or horrible happened in their lives to open their eyes to the reality of God, to realize how amazing and faithful and loving and caring and personal he is. So I shared my story with them as openly and honestly as I am with you today. And when I was done, almost every single one of the teenagers came up to me and told me that they struggled with suicidal thoughts or depression, or they knew somebody who did. That was a very eye-opening experience for me because for a long time I felt like I was the only one who struggled with it, especially as much as I did. But I realized that night how much I was not alone, and I started to develop a burden in my heart to help all of them somehow. Very shortly after I shared my story that first time, I started getting invitations to share my story other places. And that wasn't something I was ever expecting. But one door would open, and I would walk through it feeling that that was what God wanted me to do. Thinking it would be the last time I would ever share my story, and then another door would open. I'd walk through that door, and another door would open. Walk through that door, and another door would open. And it was an amazing time for me because I was seeing people's hearts and eyes and minds and lives transformed. It made sense to me on a lot of levels that God would do what he did in my life to help me. But I never imagined that he would use what he did in my life to help other people. But I was seeing people choose life over death. I was seeing people choose Jesus over themselves. I was seeing people find the freedom and the hope and the love that they so desperately wanted to. And as I was praying about the reasons God kept me here, I realized, first and foremost, the biggest reason that God kept me here was so that I could come to know him in this personal and really real way, and so that I could spend eternity in heaven with him. But what he wanted me to do here, I was still praying about. Eventually, I felt like he wanted me to go into full-time ministry and missions. And that's not something I could have ever imagined I would do when I was in high school. But I felt like that really was what I was supposed to do. So I started a ministry called Reaching You Ministries for people who struggle with suicidal thoughts and depression. Our ministry is to help the hurting, the hopeless, the lost, the suicidal, and the depressed. I called it Reaching You Ministries because I wanted everybody to know that we're there for them. I feel like all of us fit in one of those places at some point in our lives, and I wanted everybody to know that we're there to help them. And I started attending Moody Bible Institute, which is something I could have never, ever, ever imagined I would do. But being there was very confirming for me about going into full-time ministry because I never really liked school growing up. I really just liked the social aspect. But being in Bible college was a very, very special experience because I loved studying the Bible. I loved studying ministry. I got straight A's for the first time in my life. And while I was at Bible college, I got an opportunity to share my story on the Oprah show. And again, that wasn't something I was pursuing or feeling prepared to do or looking to do, but it felt like it was something I was supposed to do, and it ended up being something I was willing to do. I didn't want to hold my story back from God. I wanted to let him use it in any way he wanted to. If it could help anyone, I wanted it to. So after negotiating with them one Wednesday, the following Wednesday, I did an interview with Oprah. And the very next Wednesday is when the show aired. And after the show aired, hundreds of emails came in through the ministry website. But there was one that stood out to me in particular, and it's because the subject line read, in capital letters, "You saved my life." And that got my attention because people had told me things like that before, but never so clearly in capital letters had I seen it before. So I opened that email, and it was from a young man who was planning to take his life that day that my interview on Oprah aired. He was just waiting for his mom to leave for work. And after she left for work, he walked into the living room with a gun in his hand, and he went to turn the TV off. But when he went to turn the TV off, I was on the TV talking about my suicide attempt, my survival, how grateful I was to have survived, to have gotten a second chance at life, and talking about how different my life was now with Christ, how much he had transformed it, how much peace, how much joy, how much love and hope I had now in my life. He said that he got down on his knees, he put the gun on the floor, he prayed to accept Jesus as his Lord and Savior. And I love to share that story because God transformed his life just like he transformed mine in the coming months, weeks, years. And he now is a youth pastor leading other people to the Lord himself. Shortly after I was on Oprah, I started getting asked by a lot of authors if I would write my story in a book. They wanted to write my story for me, and it was something I was very hesitant about doing. I didn't even want somebody writing it for me. I wanted somebody to write it with me, if anything. But I felt like it was something I was supposed to do because I was getting invited to share my story all over the world in so many places I knew I would never be able to go. But I knew that the book would be able to go all those places that I wouldn't be able to go, and I wanted to let God use it wherever he wanted to. So I found a Christian author who had approached me, who had a really amazing story of her own. Her name is Tricia Goyer, and she was willing to write the story with me. It took us about 2 years, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was amazingly worth it because, again, God has used it in ways that I could have never, ever imagined. People have told me that they normally don't like to read, but that they read this book in a weekend or in a night or really crazy things. And they've told me that they're choosing never, ever, ever to take their lives. They're choosing life. They're choosing Jesus. They are being encouraged and blessed in ways that I could have never, ever imagined through my little story, my little life. The book is now in 8 languages. It came out in hardcover the summer of 2010. It came out in paper book this last summer. And the title that was given to the book is Life in Spite of Me. It's not a title that I came up with. It's a title that somebody on the publishing team came up with. But I actually think it's something that God gave to them because there's no title that could have been more fitting. God is definitely giving me life in spite of myself, in spite of my sin, in spite of everything that I've done wrong. He's given me life physically, emotionally, and spiritually. During those darkest, most difficult times of my life, I held on to a verse that I got in a magnet when I was in the hospital. The verse on the magnet was Jeremiah 29:11. And that's where it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, but to give you a hope and a future." And in those hardest, scariest, most difficult times in my life, I held on to those verses because I believe that even when I didn't have hope for myself, God had hope for me. Even when I didn't have plans for myself, God had plans for me. Even when I didn't have a future for myself, He had a future for me. And He has continued to show me what those plans and what that future is for my life. Just this past November, I got married to an amazing Christian man who loves me more like Christ than anybody I've ever met before. And he brought 2 little children into my life who blessed me in ways that I could have never imagined stepchildren could bless my life ever. And this January, we found out that we're going to be having our own little baby boy in September. And it's special and exciting and amazing for me to tell you all of that because the story goes on. The story continues. God continues to be faithful. He continues to be real. He continues to be present. He will never, ever let you go. He never let me go. And He promises that He will never let any of us go. So I just want to encourage you to turn to Him, to open your heart and your life to Him in any way that you know how. If you have never made a decision to accept Jesus into your life, I encourage you to do that here today. And if you already have made that decision, please just go deeper with Him than you have ever gone before. Let Him transform your heart and your life in every way that He knows how. Thank you so much for having me. I want to say that this isn't a sad story. Every once in a while, people tell me that they're sorry for me or something like that. And I just want you to know that it's not a sad story. I would not trade everything I've learned in my relationship with God to ever have my legs back. And I want to close with a few verses from Psalm 40 because really this is my story in Scripture, and I hope that it's encouragement to you. They say, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God." Thank you again.